although that term is about to be dropped for reasons you can imagine. Will become the Standing Committee on Law and Justice. SCAG takes me back to those Irvine Welsh novels I read in the 1990s. But the debate about the introduction of an R18 classification for computer games, some of you may have been across that issue. But we have quite different legislative bases here. Our review timeline. We released an issues paper in May. We made a decision to put out the issues paper early for discussion and then do the consultation process. We're in that consultation process now, and we will be releasing a discussion paper in September and a further round of consultations, including public consultations and the formation of an advisory committee leading to a final report to be released in January of 2012. Now, what is the National Classification Scheme, I hear you ask? It includes those areas that are subject to the activities of the Classification Board under the Classification Act, which include films, and with films there I include DVDs, publications, or what are described as submittable publications, and since 1995 computer games. And they are overseen by the Classification Board. The area of broadcasting is overseen by the Australian Communications and Media Authority, and since the Online Services Amendments of 1999, that has also incorporated online content in the internet. An important element of the National Classification Scheme is in fact Customs, who look at and can confiscate objectionable material coming in across borders. The state Commonwealth jurisdictional issues arise around the fact that a decent part of enforcement of classification rules happens at the level of states and territories around sale, distribution and advertising. As you can see, what this leaves us with is a complex map of areas that in some instances are subject to the Classification Act, in others subject to the Broadcasting Services Act. There is direct government regulation in some spheres, there is industry co-regulation in others. In some areas all content is subject to classification, whereas in others it's only submittable content or that which is subject to investigation. At the bottom of that, noting some of the ways that things can change over time in this, when the ALRC conducted its 1991 review, it classified clothing as publications. And in trying to look at how did that happen, I was reminded of the heavy metal t-shirt scare of the late 1980s, whereby there was much concern about people wandering around malls wearing Metallica and Motley Crue t-shirts. And to the best of my knowledge, no item of clothing has ever been submitted to the Classification Board. But I think historians of the future may wonder about what seems to be the current obsession with outdoor billboards. In that respect, one in particular. So in developing the ALRC's response, we have consulted widely. We have received, in response to our issues paper, we've received almost 2,500 submissions, and that's presenting us with a major challenge to work through those. We have, of those submissions, about 90% would be submissions from the general public, and about 10% from industry organisations, community groups and other relevant organisations. We also consult at an interdepartmental level with the Attorney General's Department, the Department of Broadband, Communication and Digital Economy, the ACMA, the Convergence Review Team, Classification Board and Classification Review Board. As you can see, our submissions that we've received are over 4 times larger than any previous inquiry conducted by the ALRC, so my colleagues, including Jared Bora, who's here today, working with the challenges presented by that. Terry made reference to the data deluge and the issues that presents for what's being referred to as the digital humanities. We estimate that 2,500 submissions give us about 3 million words. And for those of you who are text wranglers here, and I look to my colleagues Jean Burgess and Axel Bruns as leading text wranglers, 3 million words present you with some interesting data challenges, computational methodologies. And here we go to our next steps. What I want to look at today is some of the general principles that we're developing around this. But as I said, the National Classification Scheme presents us with some complexities in terms of what we should be considering. Heartland areas are those covered by the Classification Act, which include feature films, DVDs, publications by referral and computer games. They're what we refer to as the hinterlands, broadcast media and online content. We should note here that as formats and platforms change, content can move from one regulatory regime to another. So a very obvious example of this is games. That placing games in the framework of the Classification Act presumes something akin to a DVD that we buy at a shop in a package. Games are very quickly migrating to mobile platforms. About 46% of gameplay on the Microsoft Xbox, for instance, happens online, and this moves it into a quite different regulatory regime. It's estimated, for instance, that the content that can be accessed from a Telstra T-Box operates across at least 5 different classification regimes. And then we have the borderland areas where the NCS doesn't currently operate, but where discussion has occurred about its relevance. And these range from areas such as mobile applications to advertising, user-created content, artworks. I could present a whole session in itself on artworks in the classification scheme, and music. We're informed by the principles of the Classification Code in developing guidelines. These have their origins historically, it may be worth noting, in the period where Don Chipp was the Customs Minister. So it's important to be aware that the political lay of the land here is not particularly straightforward. That Don Chipp was Customs Minister in a Liberal government and was the first to articulate the principle around adults being able to read, hear and see what they want, or the move, to put it differently, from censorship to classification. We have the different forms of content that we're considering here, and I note Terry Cutler's points earlier about the difficulties about getting the terminology for what we refer to in this broad category of content. We also have the question about the scope of what we're recommending, and I borrow here, with permission, from Catherine Lumby with her description of media content regulation is akin to a spaghetti bowl that's cooked up, some of it's consumed, it's put back in the fridge, then someone gets hungry, bring the spaghetti bowl back out of the fridge, reheat it, consume some more, put it back in the fridge. Then, similarly, the media legislation, something comes up, we retrofit existing legislation to that, and so forth. The question arises of when one considers cooking up a new bowl of pasta here, to put it simply. And the spaghetti bowl metaphor also arises around the difficulties in connecting the different bits of legislation to the different media around which they operate. And I would note that the recent Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee, in its review, argued that the National Classification Scheme is flawed and cannot be sustained in its current form. So I've indicated here some of the difficulties arising there. The last one perhaps worth noting, that we are seeing this shift in the nature of media producer-consumer relations around the concept of user-created content, that we're moving away from a regime of mass communication where hierarchies were relatively stable. So we're moving, in short, from silos to convergence, and I would agree with many of Malcolm's comments there, noting here the work of the Colombian economist Carlota Perez in referring to this as a new techno-economic paradigm. I won't dwell on the details there, but as we look at the various drivers of change in this field, what we observe, as Perez points out, is that each major period of transformation sees, if you like, challenges between the incumbents and what might be described as the insurgents, the status quo and those emergent forces, and the real challenges that presents us from a policy point of view. So to go through the draft principles, and we have here drawn upon the National Classification Code, the objectives of the Broadcasting Services Act, the principles outlined in the Convergence Review and other documents. We are extending the first principle around Australians being able to read, hear and see what they want, with the concept that they can also participate, they should also be free to participate in the media of their choice. At the same time, we do believe that the concept of community standards remains relevant, while recognising a diversity of views, cultures and ideas in the community. The harm principle in relation to children remains an important expectation of the National Classification Scheme. At the same time, recognising that it also has a role of providing consumer information and a responsive and effective means of addressing complaints. And one of the criticisms of the current framework is that that spaghetti bowl arises in a sense of a confusion on the part of the wider public about what pieces of legislation operate there. They don't care so much about co-regulation or state-federal issues. They want to know them issues being addressed. We recognise the need for a responsive and adaptive framework that doesn't simply retrofit new media to old legislation, but which can be framed in such a way as to take up new mutations and new forms of content that we cannot yet anticipate. We envisage this being a pro-competitive framework that does not impede competition and innovation, nor does it disadvantage Australian media content and service providers in international markets. We're looking to a classification regulation framework that can be kept to the minimum needed to achieve a clear public purpose, and that should also be clear in its scope and its application. And finally, and I think very important point, the classification regulation should be focused upon the content rather than upon the platform or the means of delivery. So we will release our discussion paper in September, and we'll have a final report complete by the end of January. And for more information about the ALRC's work, have contact details there. Thanks very much.
We've got at least 15 minutes, if not longer, for a good chat with these three experts. And if you speak, could you say who you are and take the microphone from Todd, please? So the first is Terry.
A couple of this. You talked about user-generated content, and clearly that's going to be a mega issue, and regulating content regardless of platform. And earlier we heard about the introduction of the right to communicate. I was wondering how on earth you were going to reconcile those two.
Well, I think that the right to communicate is a very welcome addition that's come from the work of Malcolm's committee. I think it's an ongoing challenge, but I would note, if I was to take an example, platforms such as YouTube is not an unregulated platform. Although about 48 hours of audiovisual content appears per minute on YouTube, this is not an unregulated space. It may well be that the users themselves are to become, agents in this process. It's certainly not going to be the case that everything will wait until a decision comes out of the classification board's offices in Surrey Hills.
Yes, Jason and then Tom. You better get a microphone. Please just a bit ahead of you.
Just for Richard and Malcolm, you talked about the benefits of industry, or to representing industry, which is benefits from regulation. You talked about the role of government here, which benefits by supplying regulation. Neither of you mentioned the word deregulation, or the benefits to consumers. Where do consumers fit in this program?
You first mentioned deregulation, you mean the reduction in regulation.
Yeah, effectively, why not abolish content regulation?
Yeah, well, certainly the first principle that we have identified, as well as installing the principle of freedom to communicate as a basic principle, also says where regulation is required, it should be the minimum needed to achieve a clear public purpose. So there is a tilt towards the reduction in the amount of regulation, simply by those words. And certainly my experience over many years as a regulator is that there is a direct relationship between policy blurriness and the